Сайн байцгаана уу хүн үзэгчтэй. Өнөөдөр манай Defacto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Германы иргэн Харвард их сургуулийн Рузвельт сангийн зөвлөх. За мөн Нью-Йорк Таймст бичдэг. Мөн Германы алдартай Die Zeit сонинд мөн Wirtschafts Woche right? Германы ийм сонинд 7 хоногийн тусам сонинд бичдэг. Мөн Berggruen Institute гэж байдаг. Тэдний World Post сонинд бичдэг. Мөн өөрсдөө the European буюу Европ хүн гэсэн ийм сэтгүүлүүдэд өөрийнхөө нийтлийг гаргадаг зарим зохион байгуулсан ийм алдартай хүн оролцож байна. Ноён АЛЕКСАНДР Görlach гэж хүн оролцож байна.
АЛЕКСАНДР Görlach, ёстой КАРНЕГИЙн зөвлөх профессор. АЛЕКСАНДР Görlach Ромын Pontifical Григорийн их сургууль, Туркийн Азхарын их сургууль, Людвиг Максималын их сургуулийг докторийн зэрэгтээ тус төгсжээ. Английн Кембриж их сургуулийн ахсах судлаач, Германы Лифана их сургуулийн хүндэт профессор тэрээр Нью-Йорк Таймс сонин, Германы алдартай Die Zeit сонин, World Post сонинд бичдэг. Мөн The European сэтгүүлийн үүсгэн байгуулагч. Тэрээр We Want to See You Fail номондоо инновацид Германы өнөө үеийнхэн хэрхэн нөлөөлж байгаа талаар бичжээ.
Good morning.
Hey, how are you?
Great. So you had an interesting forum yesterday. You made a speech. Tell us about why you need that. What was the purpose of that forum, ethics forum?
Oh, there was like by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, a German foundation affiliated or close to the Social Democratic Party. They invited me over to give a talk on ethics in liberal democracy. And we have been striving on topics about populism and how populism is challenging, to say the least, liberal democracies nowadays and what role media plays in a liberal democracy.
Yeah, indeed, populism is something that we're also suffering to a certain extent in Mongolia. I would like to ask you a bit about your work you have been doing. You are looking into Western and Muslim societies, their narratives, right? You have been studying this topic, and this topic is very kind of current because we're just now witnessing a very unfortunate and criminal case of killing a journalist of Saudi Arabia in Turkey, in Istanbul, in their own consulate of that country. What is your take on that? I mean, Saudi Arabia now only said that he was killed, he was in a fight, kind of fist fight. But it is not only, nobody is talking about his body and what exactly happened. Okay, this is something that is not completely clear, but one thing is clear, he is killed, etc. But how you take overall bigger picture of this case?
Well, I have obviously no insights into what happened in Istanbul. I mean, on account of my studies, I've been looking into Muslim societies and their narratives and Western Christian societies, and I lived for a while in Turkey and in Egypt. But that has been a while ago. It was in 2003 and 2004. So, and if you ask for the bigger picture, back then there has just been released in the fall of 2003 the United Nations Development Report, and they were like claiming and stating that like literacy rates in the Arab world in total are declining, and there is 11 million Greeks and there is like 300 million people that speak Arabic, but there have been more books translated into Greek than into Arabic. So you can see like a brain drain in the region that goes on for quite a while. And obviously if you are under autocratic rulership, as Egypt used to be and is again, you can tell why that is. So critical thinking, and which is assessed by reading a lot and getting like a variety of ideas onto your table. Of course, if it's not very like what the leadership, so to speak, desires for its citizens or for its people, subjects, you have to say. And Turkey has been back then quite the opposite. So when I went from Egypt to Turkey, Istanbul was about to become like a global city, and sure, it was a Muslim city. I mean, the inhabitants by majority are Muslim, but you couldn't really tell. It was like a modern sort of city as well, and people had hopes in Mr. Erdogan's new leadership. So now, 14 years in, you are, of course, disappointed about how Turkey has evolved and developed.
Please tell us for Mongolian audience, in general, bigger picture of the Arabic world. How many of altogether countries, people, and how the religious dividing them, the Sunni, Shiite?
Well, I'm actually like not the expert to talk about this, but there is like the majority of these 300 million Muslims are Sunni, and there is like countries in Lebanon, Syria, Jordania, if I'm not mistaken, that have a Alawite minority. You have Iran, basically, which is the Shia, which is another denomination in Islam. But Sunni Muslims are 90% of, if I'm not mistaken, of all Muslims altogether around the globe. But like in countries like Syria, but also Iraq, you had like a mix of denominations, also Christian minority. And so that was like, let's say, under the reign of Saddam Hussein, they were like balancing these by like giving, for instance, a Christian also a post as a minister in the government. And you can see like that some of the conflicts that we see nowadays regarding Syria, but also like in general in the region, derive from influence spheres that Iran and Saudi Arabia, Iran for the Shia Islam and Saudi Arabia for the Sunni Islam, you know, take to battle, if you will, in that region. So it's about like the dominance over the region, and that's like the big battle between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Do you see any time soon these large two countries get together or somehow find a more common language, and for the sake of their own people, so that the region is becoming more settled?
Well, I don't see that very much. Do you have the interests are different, like to say the least, and you have Russia, which is like intervening in the region. You have also Turkey being like very strong as a you know, from the Mr. Erdogan perceives Turkey to be like the follower of the Osmanic Empire, the Ottoman Empire, which also reigned over these lands. So you have lots of interest groups, also global players like Russia. And this is like not only about Iran and Saudi Arabia, you have also the interests of the United States and basically the world community in this area. And not to forget that it's like the cradle of the three monotheistic religions. So that's like even, I mean, if I understand correctly, Mongolia is majority Buddhist. So you're out of this crazy game. Lucky you guys. But like, of course, if you look into the Middle East, into the region, it is of quite a concern and interest for billions of people around the globe.
I'm asking is because the growing immigrants, illegal and legal immigrants to Europe from these mostly Arabic Muslim countries, and also the same what is happening today in Mexico from Honduras and other countries also trying to reach the U.S. shore, U.S. border, and all these fights. Mexico trying to stop them, and it's 7,000 people moving, and the war now in Yemen, where today not only 11 million people expected to be starving, but 14 million, which is a half of the country. And it's a really concern, even in Mongolia, because it's far, but still where we go now in the world. I'm asking the questions because you have very interesting website. You are one of very interesting key figure in saving liberals, okay, in that way. How do you see in this whole current content these liberal values? Are they becoming more valuable or less? And
I think we live in something I call in my work an age of identity, where you find, like from China, Russia, Turkey, but also in many European countries and the United States, a retrieval on old narratives, which are mostly tribal. And this is because of, I mean, a variety of reasons we can dive into. But basically these new waves of populism, they, you know, define humans by their ethnic background or by their religion, and they claim like to be themselves representing like a clear, pure version, let's say, of white Americans or whatever, but neglecting the fact that our modern concept of citizenship is not about blood or race or religion, but about like adherence of a state, of a civil society that is like forming the democratic institutions. And this has helped in the last 60, 70 years to build more juster societies, because obviously these political rights, they are corresponded by social rights. So we have, even in countries in like the United States, where like these social rights are sort of like put aside by utopian go Western sort of narrative that like was not like emphasizing on social rights like the Europeans. However, we have been establishing an order that has tried to make, you know, our conviviality much better than in times before. And just in parenthesis, when you talk about democracy and like some figures like the Hungarian Prime Minister says like he is not in favor of a liberal democracy but an illiberal one. And I think there is no such thing as an illiberal democracy. If you look back into the Second World War worlds, like go to the antiquities. Do we want to have this sort of democracy again? Like there were slaves who were not allowed to vote and women were not allowed to vote. So we do not want to go back to that time. So the idea of going to an ideal state where the majority always prevails is like, it's a fraud, basically. And the refugees remind us of our humanist, or if you would say like in a European context, of our Christian obligation to see the human being and not to see his race or its religion, but rather be like living up to the ideals that we have formulated in the liberal order. And frankly, there are 60 million, if I'm not mistaken, the number is 60 million people that are somewhat on the run and being refugees, and they have all sorts of religions and ethnic backgrounds. And we have to deal with that. I mean, now Mr. Trump is like abusing the caravan, as he calls them, 7,000 for the midterm, for the election, but he rather should be dealing with the people and the problems those people have. They are just like outside the borders of the United States and Honduras and Venezuela. I mean, we can now talk about the problems these countries have. They have seen natural disasters, they have seen like corrupt governments. So like if your answer is like, yeah, we bring the National Guard to the border, that's not a sustainable idea or policy measure, and it's also not living up to the ideals of Western liberalism.
Yeah, yet there is an issue, but however this trend is going up, and what you said, the values, liberal democratic values, which brought the largest liberalization or the largest prosperity among the largest amount of population ever in the world, and this one is growing, and people, I mean, take America, it's the result of all global world, the way people live in America or in Western Europe. Yet we have more and more people are fighting against these values, and people like this in Yemen, in Honduras. How to get these people understanding the values for having better governance, non-corrupt governance, more free market?
Yeah,
how to impact on that?
Well, if you look into the post-Second World War world and you look into the Pacifics and into Western Europe, so both were affected by the war, you had by the leadership of the United States the idea to foster economic collaboration and by that step by step come to a closer political understanding. So the idea was like education fosters people's like drive for innovation but also for civic participation, and that will of course help the economy to develop. And that was successful in Western Europe and in the Pacific. If you look into Japan or South Korea, you also can look into Taiwan for that matter, and for a certain time also like China was part of this sort of realm of ideas. So you cannot say by all means that this Western liberal idea and ideology has not worked out. It has worked out splendidly in Western Europe and in the Pacific, so that's a fact. So what happened in the meantime? So nowadays, and there is not much argument about that the figures show that the GDP of countries is rising, whereas at the same moment, like the household income is stagnating. So you have this gap between these two graphs, and the question is, what do we do with it? And since this liberal idea was so successful, of course, people, if you have civic rights, it doesn't help you if you have no social rights, so they go hand in hand. So the promise is like political liberty, but also economical progress and social stability and security, if you will. And in the Euro crisis, for instance, in Europe, half of a cohort in Italy and Spain lost their jobs or didn't find a job. So that means like Europe is not living up to the promise of social well-being or social welfare. And that's a problem all across the globe in all liberal democratic countries. And we have to be looking into what can be done, because even though these are now buzzwords like AI, machine learning, there's also no doubt that we are at the verge of a new era of industrialization. And we know from the past that in this moment, jobs you lose jobs, and you have a time of uncertainty in which you try to regain new jobs. And we are in such a period, and that is what is abused by the populists, who then cry for like national ideas and nationalist ideas of economy and of political order. You see this in America, where Mr. Trump says, "I'm a nationalist," and given the engagement of the United States all across the globe and its trade ties and its political influence, this is quite a statement, because it's just breaking up 70 years of the work being done by Americans and made America the leading power, also the leading soft power on the planet. So that's what we see at this moment. But it all goes back to the success model, where political participation and social rights come with economical progress. You've seen it in the Pacifics and in Western Europe, and now this is at least stagnating. And as long as we don't find a solution to this problem, liberal democracy will be in crisis.
What are those solutions, do you think, in the near future you'll find?
Well, I mean, there is lots of things out there that are discussed, and you have claims for basic universal income. We can talk about this, for instance. You have claims about taxation, like of the big digital corporates. I mean, you have like, you know, the names van der Bilt and Carnegie and names from the 19th century, and in this century you have Google, Amazon, and all these like Bezos and jobs like these billionaires who became rich in these new eras of technological development and innovation, and like each era then comes up with this a new version of the social question. So what I want to say by that is, it may not sound like a very liberal answer to say, let's think about basic universal income. I'm not even saying that's going to be what we have in the end, but we have to think about how to close this gap between the rising GDP and the household income, because what all the forecasts tell us, this is going to be, widened. The gap is going to be widening in the future. So you have to be looking into what can be done to ease like people's needs on a monthly basis. So either you give healthcare for free or public transport for free, so people don't have to pay for that, and that eases their you know, what they have to the burden they have on monthly spending. But all overall, we have to be looking into equal access to education and to like the societal framework.
All those things you said, that there's healthcare, public transportation, education, all this require more and more tax.
Oh, sure.
Which is decreasing the competitiveness of private sector companies.
No. No. The thing is, like, we tax people's work. So like this is the income tax and all these kind of things when your labor is taxed. So and that's the main revenue also of the German government, for instance. So, but now we realize we will be working less. So that will be meaning also that the income structure, as we now have for the state, is like declining. We know, like in the era of automatization.
So where they will get the money?
So, but that's what I was saying about like what we said about Google and Amazon or whatever. The taxation has to be changing, and there's models around like the robot tax and whatever. So you have to see like wealth is created like in a rising GDP, and that has nothing to do with the household income. And basically, until recently, we thought that is connected. So you look at the figures in Germany, say awesome, but you cannot, with that measurement, you cannot see like how household and single individuals live with their income. So that is not reflected in the GDP. Also, we do know that our ideas of growth are limited, not by ideology from the left or the right, but from the finality of resources, as in, the resources on the planet. So we also know we be spending like already too much.
Yep, Mongolia is being a mining based economy. We are as a part of the whole huge copper contributors in the world, and we also sell a lot of coking coal for steel industry. Basically, that's what we earn our export money, and that's the whole thing is in this society for the last 20, 30 years grown on. With just having in mind what you have just now said about the Google and other the IT things, and then you have been also making a very extensive research on the impact of digital transformation and artificial intelligence on the way we live. How those are related with that the lagging speed of growth of GDP and household income?
Yeah, I mean, this is also sort of like closing in on Saudi Arabia. Like you can see in this region that has been highly dependent on oil. Like if you would now say your country is like depending on copper and mining and what you just mentioned, you would have to be taking care of that. The revenues you make out of that is not just only staying with like a few people. You were mentioning corruption, but that the money you make now is invested in the whole of society through education and whatnot, so that you can prepare for the next level of industrialization also in your country, because also like copper mines will be finite and you have to deal with pollution, obviously. Like every introduction in Ulaanbaatar tells you that the pollution is horrible. So like there is already things you can see like where there is a flaw in this, like in the idea that we had back in the days. And also you get to see on the micro and the macro level, like within, let's say within Germany now the cost of living are so high that people from Poland and other countries come and help with the harvest. And compared to what they would make in England, Italy and Poland, they make a lot in Germany, so they send the money back, but it would not help them to live in Germany. So you have like, you know, immigration into your own country, but also on a global scale. I lived in Taiwan for a while, and 40 years ago they would be sewing our t-shirts and whatnot, and then the society got like developed more, and then they started to manufacture iPhones and iPads. So you have like this increase in also on a macro level that your society becomes like richer or more wealthy and also more educated, and that's something now you do mining, so you have to think about what are we doing in 30, 40 years.
See, we are talking about now the competitiveness of a particular sector. Taiwan is doing all these electronic things. They have been producing chips for Toshiba. 70% of Toshiba chips are produced there, and many other things now, iPhone parts, etc. And they found certain way where they can be competitive. How this country, you think, could find that with having all the 2 million people, having a huge land on the mining industry? What kind of competitive advantage we can find in the modern context of technology?
Well, that is, frankly, this is my second day in your country, so I would not know. So what I think and why I wanted to come here is interesting that you are like, if I say squeezed, that's not true, because you are, as a country, like it's a big country, but like you are squeezed between Russia and China, which is both are no democracies. But you are in this country after 1990. You decided you want to become a democracy, and that makes Mongolia quite interesting. And like it's all about, and as we see in the last 70 years, it's all about forming unions and unity. And so there is a connection between you guys and Korea, South Korea, and Japan and Taiwan, and for that matter, how you would then like harvest this and become like a common sort of economic hub, I wouldn't know. But if I were you, I would be seeking like the partnerships with other democratic countries in the region. So in order to, that struck me when I lived in Taiwan because of historic reasons. So there has been like lots of like economic progress for the whole region, but for historic reasons, Japan and South Korea still are not good friends. And also there's no much like debate about how to together form a unity and like formulate an alternative against China and China's political system. So it's rather than Japan, before they talk to South Korea, they rather form a union with India on tackling China's rising economic dominance. So I think it would be very much helpful, I guess, if you would try to find more common ground with the other democracies in East Asia.
My questions about this democracy being squeezed in between China and Russia, where most decisions are made by one person. And here we are also struggling in between having many decision makers. You know, president has certain power, parliament has certain power, but parliament is mostly, our government is consisting of all cabinet members are parliament members as well. And it is a problem in America or Germany or in Canada. It is not, because out of 600 or so deputies, you have 10, 15 cabinet members, no problem. But we have 1/4 of all parliament. We have 76 members, and 18 of them are becoming ministers in executive power. and we have a lot kind of dilution of power. What would be the, of course, not straight all things fits to one, but in Mongolia we are looking for in search of better structure of the governance. What would be your take generically? I mean?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Like if you look into countries with similar problems in regard to corruption, and now just stating corruption generally, because there's different degrees of corruption, obviously. So I was just in Eastern Europe and in Romania and Bulgaria, and they said like, also like Hungary, because of the Ottoman Empire, they had like an idea of like the regions have to provide for the central authority. So that would have been, that's what they say, like in history, you know, podcasts, that's the origin of clientelism in that region. If you go to Latin America, you have like democratic institutions, but they are built upon feudalism. So where the question of land is a big, so you have like, even you are a democracy, you have just a few people who own all the country. So it may be like by polity being a democracy, but it struggles to become like a full democracy by the pre-democratic political system. And that you can, this is somehow, I'm not an expert on it, but I see it wherever I go, this is related somehow to the level of corruption that's possible. Because corruption means like you have like other means of negotiating deals, if you will, without or outside the system, and you find enough people who are capable of understanding these structures and engage in them. So Russia is interesting for that matter. Everybody would be saying like, yeah, they were on the way to become a democracy, but before that fully panned out, it became an oligarchy. So the democratic institutions never got hold in the country. And this is why everybody's like afraid what's going to happen after Putin, because that's not, this is a difference to China. Like I read recently something, it sounded a bit funny, like after President Xi Jinping became president for life, this one commentator said like basically Deng Xiaoping governed the whole country by only being the deputy chairman of the chess club, because he didn't need to have these titles, because he had like the grip on the country and he would be modernizing it. So they said, like this commentator said, by making yourself a leader for life, it shows your weakness and not your strength, because regardless if President Xi Jinping is in power, the Communist Party is the structure of the country, and this is why China has much more stability than Russia, for instance.
But however, now there is what it is, and how do you see that in China in the near future?
Let me come to this in a second, because I made a long answer for like coming to Mongolia. So now it's like, so I'm here just for 2 days. So, but maybe there's something underlying your today's democracy, like maybe coming from the Soviet times, that makes corruption and all these like informal ways of governing and like governing plausible. I wouldn't know them, but like what works in your favor? From my understanding, it's a country with 3 million people, if I'm not mistaken. You are religiously and ethnically homogenic. So, but the big challenge is like people moving from the countryside to the city. So, but if you live for long in the city and you have some electricity but no water, no toilet, you know what I mean, then it's like people will be unsatisfied with the system. And also like given like the global range, like cities like Mexico City where 17 million live, you can manage, there's lots of good examples how to manage a big city. And I heard like that some people also say in Mongolia, why don't we build a new capital, because this one is like so many people and it's not efficient. So, yes. But you have the resources, what you told me about mining and whatever, so you should definitely try to build a good city, like a good governed city that gives like opportunities to everyone. So you are more, because you are ethnically and religiously homogeneous, the social question is one that can be like attacking the fabric of your democracy, in my opinion.
And back to China?
Yeah. Well, in China, the country is obviously like, it has, apart from the Han majority, 55 acknowledged minorities. It has a religious diversity. It has like problems in all its fringes, like from the Muslims in the northwest, where they are like now in camps, which is like a disgrace. You have like the religious non-freedom in Tibet. So, and if I know like what I think about this is like China over history had this problem of an expanding empire, and then the empire crumbled, and now it's again an expanding empire. And if it were only like Singapore, that would help a lot, because Singapore grants religious freedom and therefore also ethnic freedom. And I think this is why Singapore, okay, you cannot compare apples and pears, but in this sense, I think like Singapore is much more a model. If you're not a full liberal democracy, then you'd rather be like Singapore, because the problems now the central government in Beijing faces is because of its like ideas of being a realm and not being like the Ottoman Empire or the Habsburgian Empire, which had like means of including different ethnicities and religions. It seems to be like in the global trend. Like in India, where you have a Hindu nationalist government, so it seems to be in the trend to say like China is a Han Confucian nation, and who doesn't fit in there doesn't belong. By historic evidence, we can say this is programmed to fail.
Okay. Well, it's very interesting dialogue we had. Of course, you cannot cover all these topics, interesting topics, for a short time. But however, I would like to thank you for coming to Mongolia, sharing your knowledge and experiences with Mongolians, intellectuals in the country. And good luck to
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you. Cool.
За хүн төлөвчтэй өнөөдөр манай Defacto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор ийм эрдэмтэн, Германы эрдэмтэн АЛЕКСАНДР Görlach оролцоо. Баярлалаа.